Hi everyone. I am making this little extra lecture because I didn't quite finish the material from from week six's lecture about women artists and how they have to negotiate these difficult gendered expectations for themselves. So I thought there seemed to be like many of you were very interested in this topic and really want to learn about women artists. So for those of you who are interested, I wanted to create this video, but this is an optional video to watch. So in this lecture, we looked in a lot of detail at Sofonisba Anguissola's career. And we looked at Mary Garrard's theory that Anguissola was very skilled at, she calls it negotiating gendered minefields, right? At kind of avoiding falling into this trap where women artists were either viewed as being super womanly, perfect women who are beautiful and pure and virginal. They fulfill all gendered expectations. Or these artists are so exceptional. They are kind of they're miracles. They're so exceptional. They basically don't count as women. So it's kind of like this most perfect woman versus not even a woman dichotomy. And a lot of women, and especially women artists, seem to have fallen into either one or the other in the Renaissance. And Garrard's theory is that Anguissola is kind of good at not falling into that trap, that she navigates through that dichotomy in a very skillful way. So in the end of the lecture, I wanted to introduce you to an example of another artist who seemed to have a much more difficult time than Anguissola did. And I don't want to blame this artist. I don't want to make it seem like she was just not as skilled as Anguissola as, at avoiding these kind of gendered traps. Really, this dichotomy is so easy to fall into. It's kind of set up for women to fail. So I don't want to say like she was just, bad at being a woman artist in this regard. But I do think it's instructive to see, how it could not turn out as well, right? For Anguissola, seems like she had a very happy, very successful life. But I did want to give you an example of a woman who didn't quite succeed as much. So this is Properzia de Rossi. She is the only female artist mentioned in the first edition of Vasari's Lives. Remember in class I said that in his second edition he added 3 more, but she's the original one. Right? She's the only one that he mentions in the first edition of his book. And she was born in Bologna, which is a city to the north of Florence. She was born around the year 1490. And it's interesting because she's not really in one of those paths to becoming a woman artist that I mentioned before. She's not a nun. She is not born into an artistic family. Her father is a notary, not a painter. And third, she's not born into like a scholarly humanistic elite family that could afford to train all of their children in the liberal arts. Her father is a notary, which compared to now in the Renaissance, a notary was actually a very important position. So, that is an upper middle class. Sorry, that is an upper middle class background, but not quite like Sofonisba Anguissola. So details of Properzia de Rossi's training are really unclear. We don't really know how or why she ended up being trained as an artist, but we do know that she was a student of a very famous artist named Marc Antonio Raimondi. Her earliest works of art are really fascinating. She started out as a sculptor, right? But not a sculptor of stone or of wood. She was a sculptor of peach pits and the stones and fruits, right? The pits of fruits. So she carved cherry pits and peach pits and all kind of like plum pits. Like it's a very strange thing, but that's what that was the art form that she worked in. The one that you're seeing on the screen is a carved cherry pit. So it's very small and super, super, super detailed. These works required great virtuosity. And according to the mentality of the time, this kind of work was really well suited to the capabilities of women because they believed that women required diligence and patience, and that this kind of artwork was better for women since they were more graceful and they were more delicate. They could carve these little teeny tiny things, right? Not big grand things, but carving little small things was good for women to do. So this is a cherry stone, and it is carved with more than 100 heads, right? Really, I don't have a nice detail of it, but it is carved in such extreme detail. Vasari says, he describes Properzia. He says she was very beautiful in person and played and sang in her day better than any other woman of her city. And because she had an intellect both capricious and very ready, she set herself to carve peach stones, which she executed so well and with such patience that they were singular and marvelous to behold, not only for the subtlety of the work, but also for the grace of the little figures which she made in them and the delicacy with which they were distributed. And it was certainly a miracle to see on so small a thing as a peach stone the whole Passion of Christ wrought in most beautiful carving with a vast number of figures in addition to the apostles and the ministers of the crucifixion. So I think you can already see that Vasari is using some really gendered language to talk about her. He's talking about her patience. He's talking about delicacy. He's talking about these like small little things with all these tiny little figures. He's talking about her patience. He's talking about how she was very beautiful in person, and how she was accomplished. She also played and she also sang. Here's another example. This is a work of art done for the Grassi family. It is the double eagle coat of arms for that family, which is from Bologna. And keep in mind, De Rossi would not have done the silver part of this. That would have been a different artist. So the silver filigree would have been done by someone else, but she's the one that carved the 11 peach and plum pits that are embedded into this silver family crest. And each of those pits is carved with a full-length portrait of a martyr or a virgin martyr of the early Catholic Church. Okay, so she's starting to make a name for herself by carving these little itsy bitsy teeny tiny things. When she was about 30 years old, she switched media and she began to work in marble. This is very interesting. For example, she made a marble portrait of a count named Count Guido de Pepoli. And this portrait was given to the Count's son, and the Count's son was very happy about it. And in thanks, he helped Properzia de Rossi get a commission from the Cathedral of Bologna, the Basilica of San Petronio, in order to work on the marble decoration around the doors of the facade of the Basilica of San Petronio in Bologna. This facade was never finished. You can see the upper story was never completed, but De Rossi made 3 Sibyls, 2 angels, and 2 narrative reliefs. The most famous of these narrative reliefs is one that has the subject of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So this is a story from the Old Testament of the Bible. Joseph, he is sold into slavery by his brothers, and he is bought by an Egyptian man named Potiphar. And Potiphar really likes Joseph. He favors him. He makes him the head of his household. Potiphar's wife, however, falls in love with Joseph and she tries to seduce him. He resists her. And then because she's angry at him, she claims that he attempted to rape her. And Joseph is sent to prison because of that. It's very interesting to note, however, what Vasari says about this marble relief sculpture that De Rossi makes. He says, in this, to the vast delight of all Bologna, she made an exquisite scene, wherein, because at that time the poor woman, he means Properzia herself, because at that time Properzia was madly enamored of a handsome young man who seemed to care but little for her. She represented the wife of the Pharaoh's chamberlain, who, burning with love for Joseph, and almost in despair after so much persuasion, finally strips his garment from him with a womanly grace that defies description. This work was esteemed by all to be most beautiful, and it was a great satisfaction to herself, thinking that with this illustration from the Old Testament, she had partly quenched the raging fire of her own passion. Nor would she. Okay, so just to summarize what's going on, Bizzari is basically saying that when De Rossi went to carve this relief, she was inspired by events in her personal life. Despite being married to another man, she had fallen in love with a handsome young man who rejected her, and this was her inspiration for creating this panel. So in a way, Bizzari is kind of saying that this is a self-portrait of Properzia, and that the man is a portrait of the handsome young man who fell in love with her and did not return her. Sorry, this is a portrait of the young man who she fell in love with, who is not returning her feelings. And he basically says, this work of art was satisfying to her, not because it was a good work of art, but because she was able to express her love for this young man through the artwork. So it's very interesting because I think in the history of art, you'll find that people are often much more likely to interpret an artist's works of art in regards to their personal life if they are a woman. And it's kind of as if women are not capable of creating art that is divorced from their own personal life and emotions. Bizzari goes on to say that this story does not have an happy ending. He says, nor would she ever do any more work in connection with that building, although there was no person who did not beseech her that she should go on with it, save only another artist who was actually her enemy, Maestro Amico Aspertini, who out of envy always dissuaded her and went so far with his malignity, ever speaking ill of her to the wardens that she was paid a most beggarly price for her work. So Bizzari is telling us that she had this rival, this enemy who didn't like her. Everyone else liked her piece, but this one guy didn't. And according to Bizzari, he spoke ill of her to the wardens of the cathedral, and they refused to pay her properly for her work. We don't know if this story is true. Not everything Bizzari writes about is true. But we do know that Properzia de Rossi did have a pretty tumultuous life. We have other kind of legal documents that tell us, for example, in 1520, she was accused of vandalizing a private garden. And then in 1525, she was accused of assaulting another artist. So she didn't live a super peaceful life. Okay. So, sorry, I was just looking over this quote here. Okay, that's from the beginning. So we talked about these gendered minefields that Sofonisba and Guasola seem to be pretty good at navigating. And I think it's clear that Properzia de Rossi was not quite as successful. And again, this is not to blame her. Women in the Renaissance were basically set up to fail, especially those who wanted to do something radical like make art. I think it helps us to figure out what the gender norms were in the Renaissance by examining the case like Sofonisba and Guasola, of a woman who seemed to deftly navigate those expectations versus a woman who struggled bumping up against them. I want to go back to the beginning of Bizzari's account of her life, because he's kind of talking about women artists in general. Properzia de Rossi is the only one he mentions by name, but he talks about how there have been some women who have not been too proud to set themselves with their little white hands, so tender and so white, as if to wrest us from the palm of supremacy, us meaning men, to manual labors, braving the roughness of marble and the unkindly chisels in order to attain to their desire and thereby win fame, as did in our own day Properzia de Rossi. So that's a very interesting passage, right? He is setting up this strong contrast between the daintiness, the tenderness, the whiteness, the smallness of the female body, and the very real physical challenges of large-scale sculpture in stone, right? Carving marble is a physically demanding art form. And for Bizzari, sculpture is fundamentally masculine, right? It is a fundamentally masculine task that requires intense physical activity and strength. And, he's kind of saying, well, there have been a few women that with their dainty little hands, so tender, so white, they have tried to wrest from us men the palm of supremacy. And he's praising them, but it's a backward, I think it's a backward comment, right? It's kind of a backward compliment. And all of this idea of carving marble using tools like chisels, that flies in the face of a lot of the manuals written at this time, which described ideal behavior for men and women, right? These manuals said that women should have elegance, grace, modesty, And that's really, those qualities are the antithesis of the qualities that are needed to do something like carve marble. Right? What makes this more complicated, however, is the fact that Vasari actually equates Potiphar's wife with Properzia, like we said. And he says that, Properzia, she's being very physical with Joseph, but she strips his garment from him with a womanly grace that defies description. So he says that Potiphar's wife here in this image has a womanly grace, but to me, I look at this and I look at Potiphar's wife and I see a very powerful, strong energy here. I look at her very thick, muscular arms. And, so even though Vasari is saying that Properzia is beautiful, he's comparing her to Potiphar's wife and saying that, she has this womanly grace. He is trying to argue still that she fulfills the task of sculpting, which, like I said, is gendered as a masculine activity, while still retaining these archetypal characteristics of femininity. So Vasari has praise for her, although a lot of it is kind of backhanded praise. Other documents, other people seem to have stronger opinions of Properzia's involvement in sculpture. For example, she was paid a very low wage for her work, and she never had any other high-profile commissions after this. Vasari goes on to talk about her. She had a kind of sad life. After abandoning marble sculpture, she devoted herself to copperplate engraving, which she did without reproach, gaining the highest praise. And so the poor love-stricken young woman came to succeed most perfectly in everything save in her unhappy passion. Again, he can't get over the fact that she was supposedly in love with this other person, right? She is also recorded as having died in the year 1529 when she was around 40 years old. Supposedly, she was indebted. She was not very financially successful. And we also know that she died of the plague, right? And Vasari goes on to talk about her death here. He talks about how the fame of her intellect spread throughout all Italy, and finally the Pope heard about her. And when the Pope went to Bologna one time, he made inquiries after Properzia de Rossi, but he had found that unfortunately she had died the week before and she'd been buried in the grounds of a hospital. And, the Pope said he was eager to see her and felt sorrow at her death. But it was even more bitter, but more bitter even was it for her fellow citizens who regarded her during her lifetime as one of the greatest miracles produced by nature in our day. Right? So this is what Gerard talks about, this idea that when you do have a woman artist, she's often talked about as being, quote, exceptional to the natural order of things, or she's a miracle of nature. It's literally what Vasari says. The idea that, a woman who is skilled at art is actually unnatural is certainly a trope that we find in Vasari's writings about Properzia de Rossi.